Bom evento a todos.
Have a great event, everyone.
Autoridades presentes, senhoras e senhores, bom
Ladies
dia.
and gentlemen, all authorities, good morning. Welcome to the first budget week for the Federal Accounts Tribunal, Federal Court of Accounts, a macro evaluation of government, and by the Secretariat of External Controls, the first budget week of the Federal Court of Accounts of Brazil has as an objective a dialogue between specialists to update, improve, and induce knowledge production in relation to the instruments of planning in the environment of the federal public administration. We'd like to ask you all to keep your microphones on mute and only open them when you're going to speak. And as for the camera, you should keep it open if you are going to speak on the event. This event will be transmitted on YouTube on the TCU's official account. On the chat on YouTube, you can ask questions and some of them will be selected and it will be answered in the end of the event. Now, the TCU Minister Haroldo Sebras. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to, with a lot of satisfaction in the name of our House, to greet and to record this very honorable presence of the Minister of the Economy, Paulo Guedes, that ever since the beginning of his time as a minister, Your Excellence has maintained the best relations with the TCU, professionally, technically, and above all, with a lot of attention to our court. So I'd like to tell him that this teaching process has been very honorable for the Federal Court of Accounts. Her Excellency, General Prosecutor of the TCU, Dr. Cristina Machado, who I'd also like to greet for her work, permanent partnership with our court. I'd also like to greet Bernardo Einstein, Dr. Alessandro Caldeira, Secretary of Governmental Macroevaluation. I'd like to greet all of my comrades here in the TCU in the name of our colleagues, and also to greet Dr. Aranzazu Monteiro, who honors us quite a bit with her presence here today. And it's with enormous satisfaction that I'd like to greet all of the other authorities, public employees, and all of you, ladies and gentlemen. It is with great satisfaction that I speak to all of you to give you all a welcome to this first budget week of the Federal Court of Accounts, that without a doubt will be an inaugural event in a long series that aims to promote technical debates of great relevance for the improvement of processes of management and control of public budget in Brazil. I'd like to thank you all for your honorable presence, and once again, the presence of the Minister of the Economy, Paulo Guedes, because like I said before, it reinforces this understanding that this will be a meeting that will also have the interest of the federal government and the Congress, and not only the TCU. It's a point of interest for all of Brazilian society. I'd also like to take this moment to highlight that this Accounts Tribunal has been taking on a change in the role, so that it leaves this rule of evaluating games that are over, so to speak, bringing external control to the responsibility of pointing out in a predictive manner, in a very fast manner, any kind of deviations or failures, as well as new ways to improve public administration in relation to government accounts after the exceptional situation that happened in 2016, when this court recommended to the National Congress the rejection of the accounts of the Presidency of the Republic, we've been capacitating and capacity building all of our team to look into in-depth analysis in accounting and budget execution of the federal government so that we can emit alerts and so that we can avoid extreme measures by analyzing each budget. Ever since then, we have seen that there's more care by the legislative power and the executive power to deal with their budgets, even though this does not in any way mean that we should not have the control on practices and mechanisms that could put into risk the base concepts that have to do with the theme, like new kinds of parliamentary amendments and proposals, so that we can keep our limits of finance. And based on TCU actions like the installation of the Joint Committee on Public Budgets of the federal government that gathers representatives of all the ministries, so that these increases in expenditures should be done in a very responsible way that keeps to the legislation that's in power right now. And an important part of the program of the debates that we start today will have to do with best practices, but also have to do with challenges and questions of the public employees that are at the forefront of public budgets in each of the ministries, together with representatives of the court, representatives of the Secretariat of the National Budget, and other specialists in this topic. With this, over the next few days, we will have the opportunity to shed light on the main challenges in relation to planning, execution, and governance of the budget system, with special attention to the ministries that have the most investments, or those that are responsible for social policies and infrastructure policies which have the largest impact in the population as a whole, like health and education. Every aspect that I think are the most important have to do with the role of public budgets as an instrument of transparency for political decisions and state actions, as well as the contributions of the monitoring institutions, superior monitoring institution like the TCU, so that we can enhance the credibility of budget pieces. To debate this last theme, in this morning we'll have the presence of world-remind experts whose knowledge will definitely be very important for this first panel. So, in my way of looking at it, throughout the week we'll have a lot of opportunities to rethink the basis of our republic in relation to the very challenging fiscal scenario that we have, with growing costs that impose to the state an urgency in seeking better allocative efficiency, as well as in increasing the speed in the correct evaluation of how the money is being spent in the federal realm. In this sense, I'd like to highlight that the Amendment 118 from 2020 destituted the compulsory nature of centralized data in relation to the union, states, and municipalities. This monitoring of federal budget given to subnational entities was analyzed in a hearing about the government accounts in 2020, when it was noticed that 70% of the 161 billions reais in health were applied in an uncentralized manner, plus 79 billion in credits to face COVID-19, without enough mechanisms to ensure the speedy control of these amounts. Mr. Minister, this topic was once again looked at by this court last week with the Rapporteur Benjamin Zimmerman, together with the Prosecutor's Office of the Republic, about the transparency of resources that were sent by the Union to subnational entities, social organizations, and other organizations. To sum it up, this deliberation reaffirmed the responsibility of state health institutions to keep centralized databases for the destination of these resources. It's never too much to remember that Brazil is the champion in voluntary transfers. So, this is a mechanism that I think is fundamental in order to guarantee traceability of the application of resources coming from transfers in education, health, and social assistance, with the identification of the final creditors of each payment. The existence of these informations makes it possible to use predictive algorithms to identify risks of deviations and to direct corrective actions. It's important to highlight that the Federal Court of Accounts already uses tools like this ever since 2016, when our technicians developed models for continuous audits that can identify with very high precision payments with the largest chance of having irregularities, contributing to the effectiveness of our audits. In this sense, I cannot but help but to register my belief that it's the role of this court not only to promote debates like the ones we will have this week, but also to demonstrate in a practical manner how its use and the use of technology and innovation can enhance and improve administration and control through artificial intelligence tools that are in our reach now. The impacts of the digital revolution are present in our day-to-day, and transformations that are happening in public administration, and they were really important so that the country could face the challenges that came from the pandemic. So with an urgency, we must bring these advancements to the finance and budget areas of the state. Now I'd like to take the opportunity to greet Minister Paulo Guedes and the Secretary of the Digital Economy, Luis Felipe Monteiro, with all his team, for the accomplishment of placing seventh in maturity in digital government. This was published by the World Bank. I think this position keeps us ahead of all the countries in the Americas. So the public debate on the tributary reform happened very soon, and we must use information technology as the essence of the government we want. That's agile, efficient, transparent, and without the bureaucracy of having all of these documents that really made our lives very hard. So in the survey from the World Bank, it shows us that we are going on the right path. However, we cannot. That's why, Minister, I'd like to take the opportunity to keep you all on Acórdão 2179. So this is the nomination of what we call the no drawbacks. So according to this principle, we'll have the transformation of the service and it's offered to the population. It's the obligation of the state to ensure all the resources, including budget resources, that might become necessary in order to continue rendering services in this new format. And it's not acceptable to submit a citizen that pays. We don't want to go back to the system of the old bureaucracy so that we can have electronic government. So, as digital governance has been consolidating in Brazil, entities are discovering all of the potential of AI and its predictive algorithms. It is essential that these technologies are applied well for budget administration, and at the same time that we get proper budget ensured to pay for the costs of the digital transformation as well as the operation of the thousands of services that are available on the gov.br platform. Before I end my participation and I open the floor to our guests, I'd like once again to thank you all for your presence, and I'd like to renew our desire that the debates of this first budget week will result in useful information for everyone who is involved with this team, and above all, that will have improvements of the state and for Brazilian citizens so that more and more we can have a two-way road between citizens and the government so that our society can really know more about government accounts. Thank you so much. And I hope this day is very successful for everyone. Now we will listen to Paulo Guedes.
Good morning, everyone. Ladies and gentlemen, dear Minister Haroldo Cedras, Federal Prosecutor Dr. Cristina Machado, and the Secretaries Leonardo Bernais and Alessandro Caldeira. Thank you for the invitation to participate in this event, in this eminent court, to exchange ideas on what I consider to be the base, the fiscal fundamentals are the base of our republic. Not only the budgetary were a part of the union. We have the concern with the future. As Minister Cedras mentioned, we understand that this decision is very, very important. The decision regarding the processes. So we want to go to the practice and to avoid such a strictness, fiscal strictness. Of course, for education and health and technology, these things are necessary, but for us to perform the end purposes of the country, to embrace the most needy ones, to assist people who suffered with this pandemic. So for us to execute this work very well, it's important that this work will not be corrective, but as Justice Cedras mentioned, it has to be preventive. In that sense, we have been quite close, and I'm happy that with the work that we've been done closely with the Federal Court of Accounts, we've been trying to be connected to all the different powers of the Republic. For example, the Fiscal Council of the Republic. I will talk about it in a little while. But in order for us to do this duty of the federal government with more efficiency. I'd like to remember this cooperative work that we have done. In the first year, we did a very complicated operation, and we were able to work together and make this work, make the necessary adjustments. For example, the limit of expenses was a measure to prevent some excessive expenses and also deviations of funds. However, to do the transferring of funds to government to federal government and municipalities, moving the money from one pocket to the left pocket to the right pocket, moving the money from the federal government to the state governments. And this work was well done by the Federal Court of Accounts. It was very hard, technically speaking, and we were quite successful. We were able to do the auctions. We could transfer the monies to the to the state government. And in the second year, we had again the challenge of the decentralized funds transfer, and we had at that moment a war budget because of the pandemic. I issued a proposal of constitutional amendment, but it did not prosper because we were hit by COVID-19 and we faced a very hard war on the pandemic. But I still believe, when I listened to many governors and mayors, they told me that we want the Federal Court of Accounts as a reference. The work that they do to the federal government, it is the creation of jurisprudence for the sub-federative entities. So the governors, they complained a lot when they started their mandates, saying that my economy was very weak, with very badly used financial resources. There were many debts. What about the state court of accounts? They would say that they were not very effective. They told me that the Federal Court of Accounts was much more effective. So there was a joint work with the governors, but it's hard to make a control of the state court of accounts because the people who work there are recommended by the governors. They have lifetime employment, and the members of the State Court of Accounts, they asked us for us to make them stay in a broader forum so that they could use the practices of the Federal Court of Accounts as a reference, as a jurisprudence, as standards for them to control the sub-federative entities, such as the state governments. The proposal is there. The President of the Republic, the President of the lower house, the President of the Senate, and the President of the Federal Court of Accounts, they have a meeting every 3 months. It's not a deliberative committee. It is an informative committee or meeting for them to understand what's happening. For example, if the states are going worse, financially speaking, we may have a macroeconomic imbalance, such as the case of the pandemic. But today we see a better situation in the States, and we need to broadcast this information. Our work last year in our war budget was virtuous. We decentralized the funds. We stopped the unnecessary expenses. We had an improvement in the rankings of the performance of the fiscal responsibilities of the states. So all of that was inspired in our interactions. The second example is this. Today, we wonder how we're going to do the control of the financial resources after we transfer to them. How can we control that? Well, the State Court of Accounts will perform the best practices and standards and also algorithms and the use of AI. That is done by the Federal Court of Accounts. So it is also a decentralization of the controls, but also inspired by the Federal Court of Accounts. The State Court of Accounts, they must follow the standards done by the Federal Court of Accounts. It's the Federal Court is the creator of the jurisprudence. Now, with the debt that the federal government has for companies and individual persons. And our talented Bruno Dantas, he launched a very interesting thesis. We had an amendment project for the Constitution, and he said there was an error in the origin. The executive branch, they don't have the control. If they have the order of another an order that is beyond the constitutional commands, it cannot be feasible. So we may exceed the limit of expenses, so we can have the basic functioning of the governmental machine. So again, we were inspired by the Federal Court of Accounts. We embraced the suggestions. We've been also talking to the members of the Supreme Court to find a solution for this problem. We have more examples. There are bigger examples. For example, the treatment of the patrimony of the union. For example, we are discussing on how to have stabilization funds. Can we integralize this fund with actions with shares of PPSA or actions of BNDES has of Petrobras? So all these things are practices, and the expense limit was done to avoid these risks. If we can also reduce the size of the states. We've been trying to do this transformation, and for a company that that was sold, for example, I can transfer financial resources to the most vulnerable layers of the population. For example, it's a problem that is quite simple, but it has been continuing for 1.5 years. So we need the Federal Court of Accounts to solve this problem. If the Brazilian government, the international reserves belong to the federal government. They belong to the Brazilian people. As a matter of fact, the central bank is a property of the federal state of Brazil. We have the patrimony. When the patrimony of the central bank decreases, so the federal government has to contribute to that. So this umbilical connection, this association, is a strong association between the government, the federal government, the Brazilian Republic, who is the owner of assets such as state companies, international reserves, real estate, the Secretariat of Patrimony of the federal government. Maybe is the biggest real estate agency of the world. It has lots of goods. So it all belongs to the government. This expense limit, we call ceiling, is something that we have to be careful with. I'm going to give an example of a problem that we've been facing, which is the capitalization of the New Development Bank. It is a bank that, in fact, it is the bank of BRICS. Part of our strategy as Brazilians to have a Brazilian in the presidency of this bank, and we made it. We also want to have a Brazilian in the presidency of IDB, Invest, and to have a bigger representativeness in all these entities. And we have the obligation to have an integralization of the capital. So we need to provide a contribution. It should be something around 1 billion reais. That should be a simple problem. it works like this. Brazilian government goes to a bank in where they have reserves and they have funds deposited there, and then it's just as when you transfer your money from one bank to another. That this should be an elementary operation. It doesn't have any problem, doesn't provide any problem to the reserves. Brazil just will take the money from one bank, a private bank, and moves to the new development bank. So it's interrealization of capitals. It makes no change in the level of the reserve of Brazil. So we can do that. It's been 1 year that we have to fulfill the obligations that we have there because we don't have budget space. So we have a wrong definition of uh, spending limit because first we have to generate superavit, which is the reserve from the government that they already have. But we need to have a spending space to capitalize a bank abroad as if it was a recurrent expenditure. The spending limit is done to limit the recurrent expenses. In that case, it is just a change of portfolio to move the money from one bank to integralize the capital in another bank. So in that case, I will have a capital that is integralized in an international public bank. This type of problem we will have to address together. They are difficulties, barriers for us to integralize the capital abroad. So we have a problem that technically can be done. I'm sure that if technically speaking, Semag can understand this problem. And it's just like a money transfer. It doesn't have to do with the spending limit of the country. So we want the spirit of the spending limit to work, of course, but we want to be sufficiently aware to do things that have nothing to do with this spending limit. If we transfer the wealth from one place to another without changing anything in the wealth of the country or in the way of allocating the funds, it is a Brazilian wealth abroad. So I will not be very long, but I would like to thank you all, first of all, and congratulate the Federal Court of Accounts doing this follow-up. It is a constitutional mission that you have. It is one. It has to do with reinforcing the fiscal foundations of a country. These are the bases of a country. It's what allows a country to do the end activities like education, health, science, technology. But the country needs these foundations in a very solid manner. In the practice that we had while we created the war budget and as we went back to the structuring reforms, the speed of which Brazil did this work, we went to 10.5 in the GDP as we made a comeback to the pandemic. And this year we are now in 1.5. Before it was 10.5, now it's 1.5. So it shows the commitment that we have with the future generations, working along with the Federal Court of Accounts and other entities, of course with the cooperation with the Congress. So this cooperation among the different powers make our commitments to be fulfilled. There was no lack of money to the health. We had a very decentralized combat to COVID-19, and in the following year, our commitment to the future generations was taken, and we had more or less the same debits that we used to have before the pandemic. No other country could make this transformation so fast. I'd like to congratulate everyone involved in this effort. The world can recognize our success, and this step forward that we're going to do to make the Federal Court of Account as a reference to the State Court of Accounts. We will not fulfill our mission until we make this decisive step. The Federal Court of Accounts is the reference, is the one that establishes the standards that the State Court of Accounts will follow. We don't see this commitment today, this responsibility, and it is really bad, especially to the federal government, because we don't see the same degree of control in the state level. So I reinforce my congratulations and my gratitude to be here with you. And this debate will be very rich, very fruitful in this excellent initiative of Minister Cedras.
Now the General Prosecutor, together with the TCU, Cristina Machado. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to thank you all and like to greet all of the members on this opening table, Paulo Guedes, also the General Secretary of External Control of the TCU, Leonardo Rodrigues, the Macro Evaluation Secretary, Alessandro, as well as all other participants of the event. It was great satisfaction that I received this invitation to participate in the opening ceremony of the first budget week together with the Federal Court of Accounts. Together, I'd like to highlight the importance of events like this for the strengthening of the interaction between responsible stakeholders responsible for the execution and monitoring of the federal budget. We have a variety of constitutional and infra-constitutional rules that, even though they are part of the process of budget maturing, they have a lot of interpretation problems and personalization problems, a context that demands constructive dialogue to improve budget governance. And something else that's very important in this moment when we have fiscal problems together with the increase in expenditures to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic. We can talk about the growth of inflation, the growth of our public debt, depreciation, and it makes this current scenario very challenging. Due to this reason, this event is very important for all of society that is anxious for successful solutions in our budget, with the proposal that this important planning tool will have the greatest amount of transparency, effectiveness, so that public policies can actually be very effective. As a citizen, I hope that we can use this qualified forum to debate the budget and fiscal problems that we have ahead of us, with the principle of contributing with ideas that might favor the sustainable growth of our economy, the increase in productivity, correction of inefficient allocation of resources, and the recovery of the balance in public accounts. In this spirit, I'd like to reinforce that the Public Prosecutor's Office of Accounts is available to collaborate with the improvement of budget governance. Colleagues from the Prosecutor's Office, Rodrigo Medeiros, Sérgio Calibé, are also going to participate. I'd like to wish you all an excellent budget week. Thank you very much. Now I'd like to open the floor to the General Secretary for External Control of the TCU, Leonardo Albernaz. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to greet Minister Haroldo Cedras, Minister Paulo Guedes, General Prosecutor of the Prosecutor's Office of Accounts, Cristina Machado. I'd also like to greet all of the speakers of the next panel, and I'd also like to greet everyone from SEMAGI, the Secretariat of Governmental Microevaluation. I'd like to greet all of you that are watching in this opening ceremony for the first budget week of the TCU. I think the importance of this event can be measured by Carlos, like a phrase from Carlos Zaire Brito. The budget is the thing that really improves. And now we'd like to see which way the social demands and constitutional rights will be dealt with in the moment of the destination of these resources together with companies, especially through taxing. Our federal government has been advancing continuously with budget governance, and our peer review is a good example of this, together with the OECD, about the qualification of the federal government. And as we have seen, we participated in a few discussions together with the Ministry of the Economy and the OECD. We were going to review a specific part about public budget and the priorities of the government that should be monitored by the government center. So this is a very interesting path. And in the Brazilian model of management of public budgets, a good part of the allocation of resources are dealt with by a lot of different legislative areas, not only the budget law, but also processes that create specific fiscal benefits, which also are budget allocation, but they're less transparent. So there's a natural reflection on our budget disputes, and this should happen at the light of day in a very open manner, a very transparent manner. Demand for a budget that is in accordance with our principles like impersonality, efficiency. We are in a very complex moment. The Minister Paulo Guedes talked about the beginning of the pandemic and all of the impacts that we had in fiscal and budget areas. So this debate that's very open, plural, and consequent, I think it's very necessary. We really must improve the framework of our fiscal rules in the country so that we have a more modern, more efficient design. But above all, it's important for us to be able to foster in our society the correct values in relation to fiscal administration, because no amount of fiscal rules will replace good fiscal policies. We must all follow the rules, and when necessary, change the rules through the legislation, and we must make good choices in the discretionary space that we have. Be very careful. The care with public money must be very important for all public agents and of society as a whole, that must always be paying attention of how you use what you bring in, because society is very, it's very tough to give all this money to the government, and it must be used, it must be improved, especially in the institutions that are the structure of the budget system in Brazil. And this is a collective moment for us to share best practices for public policies without, of course, leaving our legislative framework. Finally, I'd like to thank you all for the invitation, and also of being part of the opening, and also being the moderator for the first panel. And we have a lot of quality in the speakers that we'll have throughout the week, and I like to wish you all an amazing budget week. Thank you very much. Now the Secretary of Governmental Macroevaluation of the TCU, Alessandro Aurelio Caldeira. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to greet Justice Haroldo Cedrais, Minister Paulo Guedes, General Prosecutor of the Prosecutor's Accounts of Prosecutor's Office of Accounts, General Secretary of External Control Leonardo Bernays, and all of the audience that's watching us at this point. The next month of November, the TCU will be having its 131st birthday. It was created by decree In 1890, allow me to read the first article of this decree. Accounts court will be instituted to review and judge all of the operations of the Republic. That is, we can notice that the monitoring of the budget is in the very DNA of this Court of Accounts, and it is still one of our most noble missions. Even though our experience is over 100 years old, this doesn't mean that this task is any easier. Much to the contrary, over the last decade, the mission of monitoring and regulating public expenditures has presented very significant challenges to this court, and we have responded up to that standard. The TCU and the SEMAGI, the Governmental Macroevaluation Secretariat, evaluates planning and budgeting, looking at them as systems. SEMAGI also supports the rapporteur of the government accounts, which in this year is Minister Aldo Cedrais, who will do the previous decision on the president's accounts. SEMAGI, Mr. Paulo Guedes, currently it also has a few relevant works, ongoing works that I can mention a few. We cover the compulsory expenditures for 2021, the execution of the rapporteur's amendments in 2021, and all the monitoring that we do about the fulfillment of the spending limit and of our fiscal goals. The first budget week that the TCU is carrying out, it's been planned to bring to the same environment, to the same debate, a variety of different stakeholders, actors, specialists with in-depth knowledge in public finances, members of academia, of the prosecutor's office, TCU auditors, managers, administrators, many from the federal government, but a few also in the state and municipal level that will be a part of this week. So we have important panels, important debates, and public budget will be at the very center of our attentions throughout this week. Finally, I'd just like to highlight an issue that's really been bringing a lot of attention to a lot of different monitoring institutions, which is the issue of credibility. Translation apologizes, but we're having connection problems. This project has the objective of developing a manual for monitoring institutions so that they can act in such a way as to contribute to the credibility of budgets in their countries. And Minister Reis appointed 3 different auditors from our area, and we have other auditors from United States, France, Argentina, and Sweden to elaborate and develop this manual together. So I'd like to wish you all a very productive week, and thank you very much. Now I'd like to open the floor once again to the Minister Paulo Guedes. I would like to congratulate all of you, and especially I'd like to leave a message which I think is important, which I think was said by Secretary Leonardo Bernardo. He said practically that the essence of politics is the destination of public budget. It's the budget. So we last year learned a very important lesson about war times. What we couldn't do in times of peace, we were forced to do in this time of war. The powers got together, all of the powers got together and helped. The special courts such as the TCU We had a war budget. We worked on priorities, the emergency uh, emergency aid. All of this was done with politics doing what it does best, which is define resources, priorities, allocating priorities. So we escaped this trap. We are the prisoners of a public budget which is 96% already compulsory expenditure. So we weren't able to escape this heritage which came from the hyperinflation period when, for everyone's protection, we decided to connect and index and make all expenditures compulsory. We'll only get to the full exercise of politics when budgets are not compulsorily allocated and indexed in such a way that politics can be exercised fully. Every year we renew our commitment, and no one's going to lose resources. A growing economy that's growing 3-4% and that has a 3-4% inflation, then collection will go up, and every year we'll have a delta. Every year we'll have a budget programming, extra budget programming like this year and like what happened last year. So every year, that's the essence of politics. Last year, for instance, we had the following. We're going to have a contribution from federal employees. People are losing jobs or doing social distancing. People are staying home. So this year, let's delay our raises. However, maybe next year we might be able to have a raise in public employees. And now that the pandemic is gone, well, we'll spend less on health this year. And maybe the next year, that's what we're seeing in liberal democracies all over the world. This happens all over the world. Okay, let's not finance the Afghanistan war, for instance. Let's lower our expenses there. Let's spend a little more on health. So the essence of politics is translated in alliances around budget priorities, of the use of public resources. This policy ends up being frustrated when you are not able to maneuver these resources, when you only have 4% of space, of discretionary space, and 96% are compulsorily allocated. So I think that at the very margins, let's say, the annual increase in budget should not be indexed, should not be previously allocated. They should be free so that we do not have these being taken by people. Sometimes we don't have enough money for health, sometimes we don't have enough money for education, and sometimes we have 30, 40 billion because the money is all compartmentalized. Sometimes you can't even maneuver it inside the single ministry. The Ministry of Justice wanted to have a larger national force, but they don't have the resources for it. However, they have more money than they need for the penitentiary fund, and they do not need to build new prisons. So it's very important to have this spirit. There are two very important observations that were made here. Obviously, everyone who talked said a lot of very important things, but I think this essence of politics being in budgets, that's just crucial, that's fundamental. And like our Justice Haroldo Cedras says, we have the principle of not stepping back. So this is a much wider principle. It should really be valid for everything. Every reform should be a step forward. Sometimes even it might be a small step, shyer and smaller than we need, but they are steps in the right direction. So thank you so much, Justice Haroldo Cedras, for the invitation. Thank you, General Prosecutor Dr. Cristina Machado, Secretaries Leonardo Bernardes and Alessandro Caldeira. A big hug to everyone, and have a great have great work on this budget week. Minister, once again, in the name of the TCU, I'd like to thank you for this permanent work in dialogue with the TCU. I'm sure that this has a very significant effect so that Brazil can soon take back this function of planning, because we think that this gap is a huge gap and a terrible gap, and it's been there for a long time, and we must make it so National Congress, unfortunately, this wasn't be able to deal with, to have the intelligence and capacity of Senator Rosa de Freitas, but throughout the week she'll have her contributions to this debate. And I'd just like to add to everything that you've already mentioned today, I'd like to say that there's a huge concern so that together we may contribute so that inside National Congress this debate be permanent. It shouldn't happen only in the budget law time and not only in the mixed budget committee. We should be discussing public budget in all of the permanent committees and not one time a year. I think that's the big gap that we have. I think this construction inside Parliament is fundamental. Since I come from Parliament, I can say, Minister, that for the TCU this is a huge, this has a lot of meaning, because oftentimes when we need to do things in a predictive manner, this work structure that we know, let's say something they have in the American Congress and they have in Germany and other developed countries like England, where this is a permanent debate on the national budget. So I'd like to count on your strength, on your brilliance, and your capacity, leadership capacity, so that we may be able to induce so that the permanent commissions of the National Congress that are responsible for one area of public policy, they should discuss this budget permanently. Maybe we would avoid a lot of the missteps that we took in the last few decades. So I think your presence here as a teacher, as someone who knows a lot about this. So in the name of everyone who knows a lot about this area, I'd also like to greet Professor Helena Torres, and I'd like to greet all of the brilliant speakers who will participate with us throughout the week. So I feel that there's an urgent need that National Congress reinforces its technical areas inside the permanent commission, so that this dialogue between the government and the TCU and Congress exists daily, because Brazilian society will give the proper attention that public accounts and public budget really needs, because the TCU believes that there's no way to have an improvement in our democracy without this. So as an ex-parliament and a member of our Court of Accounts, I think we don't want the status quo to continue. The TCU wants to act more and more in a predictive manner, like I said, so that the risks of undue expenditures in relation to public resources for the federal government are avoided in benefit of Brazilian society. Thank you all so much, and thank you our secretaries Leonardo Belnais, Alessandro, Aurélio Caldeira. I'd like to greet all of our colleagues from the TCU and our General Prosecutor, Dr. Cristina, and all of the prosecutors in the Public Prosecutor's Office that work together with the TCU. Thank you very much. Good morning, and I'd also like to greet all the foreign authorities, all the representatives of the OECD and the UN. Thank you so much.
We now end the opening of the first budget week of the Federal Court of Accounts. Let's go straight to the panels. We're going to have the presence of the higher audit institutions in budgetary credibility. We're going to have Neemias Alberto de Souza and Aranza Guilherme Monteiro. participating. As debaters, we're going to have Bruno Grossi, Special Secretary of the Presidency of the Republic, Ariosto Colau, Jefferson Bittencourt, Secretary of National Treasure, Marcos Mendes, Specialist of INSPER, Helena Taveira Torres, a professor of the University of São Paulo, the law professor, José Roberto Afonso, researcher of the Lisbon University. To conduct the panel and moderate the debate, we invited the Secretary General of External Control of the Federal Court of Accounts, Leonardo Rodrigues Albenaz. Good morning to everyone who is with us. I'd like to thank the presence of the debaters in this panel, people who have their guaranteed competency in the federal government, and professors representing the academia. We are going to discuss the promotion of budgetary credibility and how can TCU can contribute with this purpose, especially in the Brazilian case. We are online, we are live on YouTube, and the chat is open for the participants to access the link, fill out the form, and bring their contributions with topics regarding budgetary credibility. And we will be reading your comments throughout the panel. It was important to think of this topic, of the set of institutional arrangements to allow the budgets for the constitutional priorities and the main social priorities to have a more efficient allocation of the funds. When we talk about the credibility in the budget, this aspect is very important. The economic actors, they either trust in the execution of the funds or the legitimacy will be corroded and opportunist behaviors will be done in terms of allocation of public resources, and also attempts to escape the budget and escape the fiscal rules. In a good measure to defend the budget is that the audit entities, they debate in favor of the classic principles. When they are left aside, we give space for the rules to be broken, as we can see in several situations. And the management of the accounts become fiction and they lose credibility. On the other hand, when we forget the reasons of the budget and fiscal rules, they are less of an impediment to execution of public policies in a sustainable way. I remember that we had Article 67 of the Constitution. It was possible a few years ago, but now it is quite impossible. But it's good to go back to it, to go back to the basic. Whenever somebody says that they can assume a direct obligation without thinking of the rules, it means that it's just a mere rule that should not be listened to, but it is not true. We may lose the space that comes from the legal determinations, and we start having a space in which the administrative actions determine what should be determined when the budget is approved. Is this true? Is this the right constitutional conduction, or to make this budget a fictional piece or a bureaucratical thing has to do with the public expenditure, or when we take out the strength of the rules, are we contributing to what we do not want? So these are the initial reflections to think of the budget not connected to the sectorial planning of mid and long term, or having a decision-making process based on the correct application. So these are some of the discussions that we're going to have with our debaters. We're going to start with Aranti. He is representing the UN, and Niemi is representing SEMAG. They will talk about this coordinated initiative, international initiative, with the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs in the contribution of the higher audit institutions in Brazil to promote the budgetary credibility from the external control. So to use our time the most way possible, I will hand the floor to Arantia for the presentation. Please, Arantia.
Thank you, Leonardo. Good morning. It's really a pleasure to join you today at the beginning of this first budget week organized by TCU. And my apologies for not speaking Portuguese. So you have to use the translations and of those that want to use the translation. I think you have that available in the YouTube channel. I would like to thank TCU for the organization of this very relevant seminar and for the invitation to participate in today's session. And it's really an honor, but also a great responsibility to open the substantive part of this event today. And I would like to set the stage for the discussions during the rest of the day and during the week by presenting on a project that UNDESA, the United Nations Department of Social and Economic Affairs, and the International Budget Project, IBP, are jointly undertaking in collaboration with several Supreme Audit institutions, including TCU. And this project is about strengthening budget credibility. So let me share my screen and a presentation to give you some additional information on what we are planning to do. The project focuses on the role of Supreme Audit institutions in strengthening the credibility of government budgets. And it's part of a 3-year initiative to expand our understanding, but also to raise awareness of the effects of the lack of budget credibility and promote reforms to address the key causes of budget deviations. The project builds on a pilot phase of work that IBP, with UNDESA's engagement, undertook in 2018 and 2019 to understand the extent and the causes, the reasons that explain the lack of budget credibility in countries. We have discussed the topic of budget credibility with audit officials and auditors from several countries, and there was consensus that there would be a value in sharing audit practices by some Supreme Audit institutions that are already assessing and evaluating and looking at issues related to budget credibility. And today, I would like to share a few reflections on the understanding of budget credibility and its importance, what we have found in our early research regarding the role of Supreme Audit institutions related to budget credibility, and also a few words about this project, which aims to develop technical guidance, a handbook to support Supreme Audit institutions in their assessments of budget credibility issues. The importance of budget credibility for effective, accountable, and transparent institutions has been made clear by the inclusion of a dedicated indicator, indicator 16.6.1, in the list of global indicators agreed by member states of the United Nations to monitor progress on the Sustainable Development Goals and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And this indicator measures budget credibility as primary government expenditures as a proportion of the original approved budget, by sector, budget codes, or similar. But what is really budget credibility? So let me start by sharing a definition that IBP has used in its ongoing work on this topic, building on existing international standards. Budgets are considered credible when governments collect and spend funds according to their approved budgets. The ability of a government to meet its revenue and expenditure targets during a financial year determines the credibility of the budget approved by the legislature. And in international discussions and standards, often we refer to a 5% deviation threshold as a reference to assess the credibility of the budget. But I would like to come back later to this understanding of budget credibility and highlight some other aspects and dimensions that are relevant from the perspective of Supreme Audit institutions. Why is this important? Why does budget credibility matter? And let me give you an example based on research conducted by IBP. Did you know that on average, almost 30% of the budgets for the purchase of vaccines in 22 largely low-income countries were not spent over a multi-year period, even as those countries were suffering from a shortage of life-saving vaccines for thousands of children? So imagine this in the context of the current pandemic, for example. These and many other facts on government spending patterns have been uncovered by IBP's ongoing research on assessing the credibility of national government budgets. As some of the speakers highlighted in the opening, government budgets matter to people, especially those most in need of assistance. In fact, some people consider budgets to be moral documents that lay out the roadmap by which government intends to support society. Budgets are really the foundation for achieving long-term policy and national objectives, such as the Sustainable Development Goals or those that are included in national development plans. There are several other reasons why it's important that budgets be credible. One is that underspending can impact the provision of essential services, health, education, water, sanitation. Two, persistent deviations in budgets reflect poor financial practices and increased risks of mismanagement and corruption. And finally, governments' repeated failure to collect and spend funds according to approved budgets often feeds into an ongoing narrative that governments cannot be trusted. They say one thing, but they do another. The public budget, the public money, does not really match the declared national priorities. Where do supreme audit institutions currently stand regarding the analysis of budget credibility? The literature on public finance management does not say much about the role of auditors and how auditors have contributed to understanding and evaluating budget credibility. We conducted some initial research and developed a report that uses examples of audits by 20 supreme audit institutions from different countries to assess how supreme audit institutions have or have not covered budget credibility issues in their audits. We also conducted a survey earlier this year that was sent to 40 supreme audit institutions, and we held a technical meeting with supreme audit institutions from different countries, including TCU, in May this year. What have we found? First, supreme audit institutions have emphasized the need to have a wider understanding of the concept of budget credibility, and they have highlighted some specific aspects. The need to consider different budget dimensions. Consider the approved budget instead of the originally approved budget, which is the language used in the SDG indicator, to account, for instance, for the existence of supplementary budgets. They have also highlighted the need to go beyond the quantitative rule, this 5% threshold. The criteria to determine if a deviation represents a credibility problem are not only quantitative. Deviations may be desirable or legitimate, but to assess this, we need transparency. We need information about the causes, the reasons that explain those deviations. They have also highlighted the need to consider the entire public finance management cycle. Deviation risks may not be apparent at the approval stage, but become evident and a problem during budget execution. And finally, the need to consider performance and results. Ultimately, for auditors, credibility relates to achieving the intended results of policies and contributing to people's well-being. I would like to highlight a few key findings from the initial research. Supreme audit institutions, we found, are aware of budget credibility problems. 74% of the Supreme audit institutions that participated in the survey identified this as a significant problem in their countries. However, Supreme audit institutions in general do not use the term budget credibility in their audit reports. There are some exceptions in African Supreme audit institutions like Uganda and Ghana, but in general, they don't use this term. However, the review of audit reports shows that Supreme audit institutions assess and evaluate multiple issues related to budget credibility, and the information they produce is quite relevant for strengthening budget credibility. Supreme audit institutions do not systematically conduct comprehensive assessments of budget credibility, particularly at the aggregate level. Many audits identify common factors associated with budget credibility risks, but not necessarily link these factors with aggregate budget deviations. Also, some audits identify overruns or under expenditures without providing additional analysis to understand these problems, particularly the impact of these deviations on development outcomes and results. And finally, Supreme audit institutions, we found, examine these issues through different types of audits, not only financial audits, compliance, performance, and also other inputs like testimonies before Congress or evaluations. This figure shows how 82% of those Supreme audit institutions that we included in the survey actually are looking regularly to issues related to budget deviations and budget credibility. And here you can see also in our sample the diversity of audit inputs, of audit reports that are used to look at these issues. These findings support the idea that budget credibility really cuts across different types of audits, and a comprehensive budget credibility assessment would benefit from combining different types of audit information. The lack of international audit standards on budget credibility assessments is one of the factors that could explain why auditors do not use the term budget credibility or do not talk explicitly about budget credibility in their audits. However, all Supreme audit institutions we have engaged with refer to relevant standards and sources of audit criteria when speaking about their work related to credibility issues, including relevant international budget and public finance management standards like the Public Expenditure and Financial Accountability Framework, PIFA, relevant audit standards and pronouncements, ISAI, and the relevant national legislation and regulations. We have identified 4 emerging tracks or themes based on the initial mapping of the existing experiences by Supreme audit institutions. There are some Supreme audit institutions conducting audits of the performance of the entire public finance management system, like in Zambia, or elements of the public finance management system, like in Indonesia. Many Supreme audit institutions conduct recurrent or regular audits of the execution of the annual state budget or the end-year accounts, like Brazil, Argentina, Georgia, Sweden. And most Supreme audit institutions conduct ad hoc audits that evaluate and assess issues related to credibility risks across the different stages of the budget cycle or the public finance management cycle. And also we found that Supreme audit institutions are paying attention to monitoring the recommendations of these audits that relate to budget credibility and how to follow up on the recommendations in order to address the problems that they identified. I would like to bring your attention to this third category that I mentioned, these ad hoc audits that examine issues related to credibility risks. We found that this is really a diverse universe of audits in terms of the scope of the issues that are examined. And we have tried to unpack this category by mapping and organizing some of the issues, some of the topics that Supreme audit institutions are considering in relation to budget credibility. This figure illustrates some of this mapping and provides some examples. We found many audit reports that look at the budget governance framework and looking into issues of the budgetary policy, debt management. Many audit reports are focusing on issues related to budget planning and preparation, including, for example, the macroeconomic indicators and forecasts, revenue estimations. There are not so many audit reports that look at the approval stage, but there are very relevant work, for example, by TCU, that examines the role of legislative amendments. And this is one of the topics that will be discussed during the week as well. Many audit reports examine issues related to credibility risk during budget execution, like administrative procedures, management capacity, the timing of spending. And we also found increasing attention from Supreme audit institutions to issues related to management of performance information and data and indicators, which are key for budget control and oversight. And all these issues relate to specific credibility risks and challenges, although the reports not always make this link. For example, if we have unrealistic macroeconomic indicators, this can undermine the credibility of revenue forecast and can also lead to multiple budget revisions due to the resulting mismatch between revenue and expenditures. Let me say now a few words about the work that we intend to do. So we are planning to document and synthesize in a handbook audit practices that can be used by Supreme Audit institutions in conducting analysis of the credibility of government budgets through external audits. The handbook will expose to auditors how their work can inform analysis of budget credibility, illustrate how audit work already conducted by Supreme Audit institutions in different countries provides insight on budget credibility issues, and also outline key steps that Supreme Audit institutions can contemplate when aiming to assess and address budget credibility in the respective context. All Supreme Audit institutions engaged in the initiative have emphasized the importance of considering the diversity not only of the Supreme Audit institution in terms of their mandate or the scope of competencies, but also the diversity of the institutional context and the budget systems in which they operate and develop their work. For example, in terms of the fiscal context of the country, the role of parliaments regarding amendments, whether an independent fiscal institution exists or not, what are some of the cross-cutting functions that affect credibility risks, like monitoring and evaluation or planning. This is something we would like to keep at the core of the work in the handbook, to be able to account and reflect this diversity. The production of the handbook will be done in a consultative and collaborative way, and we have convened a group of resource experts from interested Supreme Audit institutions to take the lead and develop the contents of the handbook in collaboration with UNDESA and IBP. And we will also convene a wider informal reference group with representatives from Supreme Audit institutions, but also other stakeholders and experts to ensure wide consultation, mobilize additional information and data, and engage also in the peer review process. This is an international project, as it has been mentioned, and we have confirmed the participation of different auditors from different Supreme Audit institutions, from Argentina, Brazil, Georgia, Indonesia, the Philippines, Morocco, inputs also from the US Government Accountability Office, say Jamaica, and of course other Supreme Audit institutions are welcome to join the effort as well. And we will actually rely on inputs from many Supreme Audit institutions collected as part of the research, but also through the reference group. In terms of the timeline, we are about to start the hard part of the work. So we will be convening a meeting of the resource experts in a couple of weeks to start the discussions for the development of the contents. We would like to have a draft ready to be submitted to peer review in the last months of next year and hopefully launch the handbook in early 2023. And throughout the process, we would like to engage with the leadership of Supreme Audit institutions, with experts, with other organizations, organize also different dissemination initiatives, discussions, and activities like this session today. The structure and the contents of the handbook will be developed, as I said, by the group of experts. Tentatively, based on the initial discussions, we have identified three main blocks of contents. One block would focus on the concept of budget credibility from the perspective of Supreme Audit institutions and present the analytical framework that will be used to map and organize the different audit experiences. The core of the handbook will be practical chapters that systematize and provide examples of existing practices in auditing issues related to budget credibility, organized by theme and considering both the aggregate and also the sector and program level. And we would like these chapters to be as practical as possible, providing examples, identifying useful tools, and developing some kind of checklist for auditors. And finally, one chapter would focus on how supreme audit institutions are monitoring audit recommendations related to budget credibility and follow-up actions to address those recommendations. And we would consider, for example, the use of information and communication technologies, engagement with public entities and officials, engagement with other stakeholders, the use of incentive systems. Before concluding, let me just say a few words about the expected benefits of this work, of this project. Of course, we aim to raise the awareness of auditors and supreme audit institutions about budget credibility and how audits can inform budget credibility evaluation and analysis, and promote a more systematic approach to assessing and evaluating budget credibility through external audits, and in that regard, strengthen the skills, the capacities, the tools that auditors have at their disposal to assess and evaluate credibility issues. But we also want to engage with other stakeholders around budget credibility and promote and advance the significant role of supreme audit institutions in this area. Ultimately, the aim of the project is to help strengthen budget credibility at the national level in the different countries. I thank you for your attention and really look forward to the discussion during the session and during the week. Thank you.
Obrigado, Arantia, pela apresentação. Foi ótimo para dar panorama geral, né, do projeto, de qual é a ideia, de como a iniciativa deve se desenvolver, de quais são os benefícios que ela pode trazer.
Certainly for all the entities that are participating and for the countries above all. It's like we said, if this will increase the budget credibility of countries, and this can bring a lot of benefits. Just like to comment on the perspective of this. In the TCU, we have our second speaker, Nemias Albert. Go ahead, Nemias. Good morning. It's a great satisfaction to be a member here in the first day and the first budget week. And I'd also like to greet everyone here on the table and to greet Arantia Guilherme Monteiro, who is the representative of the Economic and Social Matters from the UN. And together we are conducting the cooperation initiative to promote the participation of external control into budget credibility. I'm going to go through our presentation very quickly, but before I start my presentation, I'd like to remind you all that are watching this live that we already have a link of the YouTube transmission. In the YouTube transmission, in the description, we have a link so that people are able to participate in our interactive platform. I'd also like to reinforce Leonardo Bernaz's invitation. We want to hear your opinions. You will subsidy our debates, and as much as possible, we will forward these questions and suggestions to our panel, our specialist panel, so that we can have further analysis in the TCU. And finally, for the people who are here watching the event, in the playlists area on YouTube of the TCU, you will have the programming of live events that will go on throughout the entire week, throughout this budget week event. And the programming of this event is very well defined with the times, and in every event that will have YouTube transmission, we also have simultaneous interpretation in English in a different specific playlist for English language interpretation. So participation and engagement is very welcome. I'd like to start my presentation very quickly. Well, I'm going to talk a little bit about the project or strengthening of budget credibility through external control. I didn't actually present myself. My name is Nemias Albert. I'm a TCU auditor in the Governmental Macroevaluation Secretariat of the TCU. From our point of view, initially, I'd like to remind you the engagement of the TCU with international cooperation is nothing new. We have a successful history in international cooperation, and I'd just like to mention a few examples. We had a lot of methodological help as far as performance in a partnership with the United Kingdom in the 2000s, and we had a variety of other partnerships in important themes like financial audit, government accounts, environmental auditing, and the most recent one. This isn't an exhaustive list. These are some highlights, and we have the Integrar project that we have together with the OECD. This project is a part of this partnership, and it involves auditing and monitoring of multi-level public policies that involve different levels of the federation. And this is the TCU together with municipal and state control institutions. So you can see that we already have a robust amount of experience in international cooperation. And now, let's go into the description of the project that Arantxa has already described. The organizers are UNDESA, the Department of Economic and Social Topics in the United Nations, and the International Budget Partnership.
Trata-se de engajamento plurianual, ou seja, envolve engajamento, compromisso plurianual nessa parceria que vai além de.
We have a partnership that goes beyond a year-long period in some exercises.
Muito relevante a cooperação.
We think this is a very interesting cooperation, and we have some key points. We have in existence of a specific work group on budgets, and since INTOSAI is the international organization for audit institutions like the TCU, but we don't have a specific work group on budgets. So because of this gap, this cooperation project becomes more and more important for the TCU. Like I just said, we have some references in auditing budgets internationally. However, we don't have a work group, permanent work group, and the importance of the global agenda was also mentioned in the opening ceremony, and this is really important today due to increase in expenditures due to for governments in all the world, because of the moment that we're going through due to the COVID-19 epidemic. So this rebalancing that was necessary in order to deal with the pandemic is a great challenge in terms of budget credibility for the future. And the partnership will develop a reference document which will be an asset for these control institutions. The expected benefits are interlocution with government auditors from other countries. Will participate in a global cooperation initiative that will increase this theme, will improve this theme all over the world. So this is very relevant and important. We'll have institutional learning for the TCU and the validation of our practices. As control institutions, we're always looking for improvement of our practices and action in the development of this reference document. So, like I said, we're creating this technical document, which will be an important legacy asset for this cooperation. We've already had an initial meeting that happened from 26th to 28th of May. We've also have noticed that the Supreme monitoring control institutions are very interested in this. And how do we get a concept of, how do we develop this concept of budget credibility? It involves different practices. Like I mentioned here, there's a diversity of different approaches in different countries. The different control institutions have different mandates. There's sometimes fiscal rules are the only parameters that are evaluated. Other control institutions look more into transparency, while others are mainly concerned with the results due with audits of the efficiency of public policies. So different control institutions have different mandates so that we can reflect and develop a technical document about this. I think this is very valuable and relevant for us. So what are the next steps? The TCU was invited to be a part of the specialist group that will develop this document. They are auditors from the Governmental Macro Evaluation Secretariat. The first meeting will happen next week, the first specialist group meeting, and our estimated deadline is 2023. And in an event in which we participated, we looked into the experience of the TCU into budget auditing. We have a history and a capacity that's already relevant in budget auditing, and that's something we'd like to share. So we have an existence of a specialized unit for budget auditing, which is SEMAG. This was very well received by our peers in the event. We also shared our monitoring of the pluriannual plan and the bill of the budget law. So we start monitoring from the very start when it's still a bill. So the TCU every semester talks about the budget, and they do previous decision on the accounts that's presented by the presidency. We have audits on the provision of public policies, looking at the effectiveness and results and the efficacy, as well as budget allocations. And finally, we have a variety of different theses and we can also receive accusations. We have consultations and representations. We use representations as an example here. For instance, legitimate authorities can bring representations, senators and members of the public prosecutor's office. So this is our last slide. I'd like to really foster the debate with our guest debaters. So here are themes for our debate. How do you develop the concept of budget credibility? Because this theme is not a strict definition. What are the dimensions of budget credibility that we think are relevant to analysis? And beyond the conceptual issue of budget credibility, how do control institutions contribute to the improvement of budget credibility in a substantial manner? And so I'd like to talk about this issue not only from the point of view of the TCU, as well from the more abstract point of view that involves control institutions internationally. And I'd just like to remind you all that the research that we have in the description of the video in YouTube, I'd like to everyone to participate. Here we have a slide from our survey. I'd like to invite you all to take it, and I'd like to thank you all for your participation. Now I will open the floor to Leonardo Albernaz.
Thank you, Nemias. Congratulations to your presentation on the review of TCU by using examples. We have been dealing with the transparency and credibility regarding the concept of budget credibility. Now we're going to have a moment with our debaters. I'm going to start with Bruno Rossi. We want to have 2 rounds, so I'm going to ask you to use 5 minutes for your first exposition, so we can have each one of you to speak 2 times. And from the questions that were brought by Nemias on how you see the budget credibility and the elements that we need to consider, thinking of the Brazilian case as a standard to develop budgetary credibility, how you see the role of the Federal Court of Accounts in this case. Good morning, Leonardo. Thank you for the invitation. I would like to congratulate Arancha and Nemias for their presentations, their very interesting approach. I would like to greet my dear colleagues in this panel, Marcos Mendes, Antonio Colau, Helena Torres. It's an honor for me to be here with you in this debate. We have been following up the work of TCU for a long while. Since the inauguration of SEMAG, its first initiatives and its improvement throughout the time, the capacity that was acquired throughout this time. Budget is not something trivial, especially in Brazil. The budget is a relatively complex model. Imagine that in some countries, you have the budget as a material law. That is, the works are done in the budget. In Brazil, we have some atypical situations when there are some policies and expenses out of the budget, and it brings pressure to the budget. And it brings complexity. Different from other countries such as Germany and the United States, Brazil is different. Brazil creates the expenses outside the budget, outside the budgetary institution, and it brings a lot of pressure to the budget. Initially, you mentioned the respect to the classic principles of budget. If we really go into that, we will see that we became apart, distant from it. The reason of that is what Minister Paulo Guedes mentioned in the opening of the event, of the large amount of obligations that we have in the budget and the small capacity that we have to manage one situation or another. It is interesting because we are kept in a duality. If more information or more detail in the budget would guarantee more credibility. That is, the fact that you have a more detailed information or more information, will this guarantee credibility? I think of credibility in terms of respecting the initial planning. So what you planned initially, are you really able to deliver that? Are you able to carry this out? Obviously, regarding the dimensions, we have the political dimension in the role of the creation of other policies and obligations that are not presented in the very moment of the budget discussion. The fiscal and economical discussion is very important, of course, and we have had many attempts in fulfilling the budget goals. But of course, in a pandemic moment, it's complicated to guarantee the credibility in this moment. And even I could leave it as a suggestion for the handbook that we intend to build. Do not think of pandemic, but think of crisis in general. How can you guarantee the credibility during a crisis, during an abnormal situation for the budget? I think the control institutions contribute to the improvement of the credibility. You can see the role of the Court of Accounts itself that has contributed with the government in bringing more transparent points to the budgetary documents. So it's hard when you have advancements in the budget. It doesn't stop you to have credibility. You can have advances anyway. Our legislation is quite old, from 1964, most of it. Other situations were modernized eventually, but there are situations that are still based in 64. So I think it's possible for you to make some modifications to improve credibility and still advance. The classic mechanisms exist, but they need to be updated facing the new reality. It's not about disrespecting them, but we need to bring them to a bigger and current reality. And regarding the topic that you asked, I'd like to make a comment on OECD. They have discussed many things regarding governance, government, budget. I think the role of the concept of credibility, when you think of the handbook, you can think of other interactions. Of course, there is a focus in the control entities, but we could consider the evaluation of other stakeholders, the interaction with other stakeholders. So these are my initial remarks. So we can have the chance to listen to the other contributions. Thank you, Bruno. It's interesting how you can make it clear and how it reflects in the other rules of the game when you respect the classic principles, but how you can think of the present day. And your final remark, I think it's a great suggestion. And so I'd like to ask Arantxa to make some comments on this possibility. I think it's really worth it to have this vision during the building of the handbook. Well, I will hand the floor to Marcos Mendes now. Marcos, the floor is yours. Good morning to you all. I'm going to turn on my stopwatch, so I will not use too much time. Thank you for the invitation to be participating in this meeting. I greet all the participants. We're talking about budgetary credibility, so we have to think of the phenomena that has threatened the credibility of Brazilian budget in the past years, which is the increase of the parliamentary amendments that the analysts, including me, think it is a problem for the budget. We need to say that Brazil improved a lot in terms of transparency and creation and execution of the budget throughout the past decades. The technical teams of the Congress and the TCU, the instruments that they have used, the amount of data available in real time, the complete transparency for the analysts to follow up what's happening, it is really wonderful. But in the first half of the first decade of the century, we had problems. Some items, important items of expenditure not included in the budget, not considered as extra budgetary because they were patrimonial changes. And as a main example, I consider the loans of the National Treasury to BNDES, which led to the impeachment of the President of the Republic at that time. Thinking of this phenomena, that we call pedaladas fiscais in Portuguese, we thought of an idea of thinking of the universal budget, including all types of expenses, to avoid parallel accounting. But in 2015, we had the beginning of the obligation of the parliamentary amendments. First the individual amendments, and then the group amendments, and then finally, for the budget of 2020, the amendments of the repertoire. Well, it shows, it represents a large amount of the budget. We have 34 billion of reais in parliamentary amendments. It is really too much. Every democracy has a certain value allocated for the Congress, but now these amendments are out of control because the allocations are done in a transparent way. And we can see that. So we cannot discuss the credibility of the budget without mentioning the two main points that affected the credibility of the budget in Brazil in the past years. First, the increase of the command of the Congress in the budget. They are trying to make it sound normal, that it's part of democracy. It doesn't seem the reality we see. The budget must be predominant in the executive branch. The legislative branch is a deliberative institution, and it cannot control a significant part of the budget, especially when you have a legislative branch in a such fragmented way as we see in Brazil, because it affects the quality of public policies. And second, I think the central role of the external control entities is to be paying attention to every possible transaction that occur outside the budget, either to administrate the limit of expenses with decisions that are not always very reasonable. So Nehemiah's question about what is fundamental in terms of credibility, budgetary credibility, is to see what is happening beyond the budget. For example, the 5G policies, they are thinking of public policies outside the budget. Also, Eletrobras policies, the possibility of having financial resources for the granting of public service, they are also outside the budget. So these are my first observations, and I thank you for the participation. Thank you, Marcos.
I'm going to open the floor to news. I thought it was very interesting about the update of mechanisms where you try to create situations outside the budget to test into the execution of public policies. A lot of them based on legislative initiatives, that's an issue for us to think about. But based on these issues that Nerias talked about, what points would you like to highlight that are really foundations for the budget credibility, and what can the TCU do in order to contribute with these pillars of credibility? I think Ariosto had a problem. Ariosto, can you hear me? I think I had a little bit of an internet problem. Yeah, but you're back. Okay, let me start again. Good morning, everyone. I think that more than trying to reach TCU's role, we're talking about a process that involves all of the budget cycle. It involves aspects related to planning of activities and the administration cycle: planning, execution, control, evaluation. Budget has a dimension that's not only technical, but it's also political, specifically in Brazil. And this dimension, as Marcos has mentioned, this has been preponderant over the last few years, has absorbed a good part of the capacity of the budget itself in order to in order to make these public policies continuous. And I think that this really shows is an indicator of the quality of our budget process and how can we strengthen this credibility. I think that now we have a series of real challenges in the strengthening of this credibility, which involves the different institutions. We advanced a lot in terms of institutionalization and rule design, but not a lot in relation to results in our process. So those things that can be offered in benefits and quality, the deliveries that we can give to society. So I would like to focus on a few challenges that I think we have ahead of us so that we can strengthen our capacity. The first has to do with the process of approval of the budget. Marcos mentioned it very well. These aspects of the legislative amendments, the growth of the participation of the legislative amendment, not that they are without merit, but how long, up to which point are these priorities given by the legislators aligned with the overall budget? So the participation of these amendments in relation to these discretionary expenditures of the public administration got to 26% of the discretionary expenditures and 74% of the executive powers programs. In 2014, it was only around 5% of the participation of these legislative amendments, and we actually reach a scene of 25% of the participation of these legislative amendments, and they gained a condition of being of imposing. It's almost compulsory, and they're no longer discretionary. So that part becomes compulsory. So they're not really discretionary expenses. It becomes one more obligation that's created by the budgeting process. And inside this dimension of the approval of the budget law, I think the amendments are also important, and we want to know what the margin is for the change in parameters related to the estimation of accounts and estimations of compulsory expenditures like Social Security, especially Social Security. And over the last few years, we have been using a prerogative that has to do with the federal constitution, which is the estimation of compulsory expenditures, so that we can have a wider margin in relation to the accommodation of parliamentary amendments. I think that this step, which was taken by Congress in the re-estimation of compulsory spending, it's a point that really makes it harder to have this credibility in our budget process. Another point which I would like to highlight is, like I said, the excess of instrumentalization, the set of rules, and the budget law. If we used only the principles like some other countries do, maybe we wouldn't need all of these rules, but our excessive rules related to the development, execution, and control of the budget, they make it so we don't look at the principles, and we more and more try to design rules and more rules that are appropriate to the process. So I think we must overcome this very important point. Yes, we must have control. Yes, we must have compliance inside our budget process, but up to which point does this make it harder to solve some problems? So this balance between control and results, we must find a balance in which we might have to let go of certain rules in favor of better results in public policies. And of course, we need to strengthen the process of evaluation of public policies. I think that might be the leg that's the least strong in this evolution of the last 10, 15 years. It might be the leg that we gave the least attention to. So we've advanced quite a bit in relation to fiscal consolidation, the design of fiscal rules to balance the budget, even though we have a variety of risks that are associated with these fiscal rules, creativity which is used and implemented throughout time. But as far as evaluation, we have advanced very little. In transparency, I think Marcos mentioned it very well. In the IBP ranking, we're in the 6th place, and we have a lot of transparency in our process. But I think that evaluation is an issue in which we really need to improve ourselves. The results of these evaluations, when appropriated together, and I think we are in a very initial stage here, even though we instituted SEMAPI, an instrument to focus on a few evaluations. The Accounts Court has been collaborating quite a bit with this, but we were not able to feed back into the process. We didn't close this feedback loop for budget administration with qualitative information that might allow us to have a better process in developing the budget. So inside my time, I'm going to respect my time, but I'd just like to mention a last topic that I think is important as far as challenges is the plurality aspect. It's not enough for us to have a great credibility result. Translation apologizes, but we're having a connection problem. So we have great challenges in relation to the fiscal medium term. We must have a system of goals so that we might be able to really absorb or establish an MDF, a program, goals that are pluriannual, sort of medium-term goals, and so that we can have an expenditure planning institution. I think that's an absence that we have. We must establish the horizon of integration. Maybe not PPA 4 years, but a medium-term instrument. I think we must really rediscuss the role of this instrument so that we can converge the budget more and more for medium-term goals in the point of view of the fiscal entities, and we must try and reach a balance between the medium term and the year by year so that this is better appropriated for the end that we want, which is fiscal budget credibility. I think that's pretty much what I had to say at first. Wow, I had so many relevant, important topics that it's hard to select which ones to comment. What really caught my attention in the beginning is that this is something very much connected to credibility. You know that before the spending limit, we used to overestimate the budgets. So now we have the underestimation of expenditures, of important expenditures. So that's another important point to raise. I think that we can comment on that. And then we have this point of pluriannuality. The very credibility of the budget depends on this. So if the budget can only see a year, we end up having problems so that different public policies that will depend on pluriannual resources are well presented or not. So we create this institutional framework. How do we deal with this issue? Professor Heleno, I'm going to open the floor to you. Thank you, Leonardo. It's a pleasure to be here in this very important event. I'd like to highlight that this is one of the most important events that I am aware of over the last few years in relation to the budget issue, because there's nothing more important than the credibility of the budget. The function that it creates in society creates certain expectations, and the expectations from the private sector and the fulfillment of the Constitution are really the basis of a trust between society and the state. I'd like to greet Dr. Arancha, Dr. Nemias, who did their presentations, my colleagues Bruno, Jefferson, Dr. Marcos Mendes, who came before me, and Dr. Roberto Afonso. I'd like to highlight a few points which I think are very fundamental here. First is the issue of budget governance. This theme cannot be left to the side in a discussion about budget governance. We have to ensure a concern that is not only normative but rather institutional on this governance, because credibility and governance walk hand in hand. Between planning, foreseeability of this planning, and execution, we have the credibility of the budget instrument. That is the great step, the great exit, the great way out for the solution that public budgets need to go through. So this aspect of trust that Dr. Encho was mentioning and the security of the stakeholders that depend on the budget, be it private market or other groups, obviously this should take place inside a few governance presuppositions which, in my way of looking at it, are very advanced in Brazil. Also, recently we have seen in Brazil a few constitutional amendments which we have not yet had the time to mature in relation to the innovations that these instruments bring, which was the case of Amendment 100, 106, and 109, which brought important changes to our normative framework, but they might not have really created a lot of repercussion in the budgets because the PPA and the budget guidelines law were not yet ready. So in this aspect, I think that our governance and control institutions are well supported at this point. And in this aspect, Nemi has mentioned an important point. How are we going to build the concept of budget credibility beyond what we already have? Because we already have a normative framework for governors, which is very important. I would say that the Brazilian budget legislation is among the best. So in what sense am I saying this? In terms of responsibility and control. But we must take a way of deciding things about how we are going to update our budget legislation. And this is not hard. I feel very free because the United States took over 50 years discussing PPBS. So we're not in the Stone Age, we're way beyond these concerns. And all the world is going towards discussions like examining what kind of a public budget do we want and what would be the best rule to structure this public budget. I think this is the aspect that will be the great challenge, and maybe from here we can extract good elements like other countries in Europe have already done their budget law reforms under the orientations from the European Union. We have a variety of different suggestions and experiences that we can evaluate. We can look at budget by performance and other issues like this. I think that here we have a few problems, and these are serious problems. First, the lack of adherence between the pluriannual plan and the budget law and the execution. The slow adherence is present in the Union, but it gets higher and higher in decentralization. So in big states, small states, small municipalities, big municipalities, we're going to see this loss of adherence between what is planning, what are goals, and what is the executed budget. Another aspect which I think is very severe is the lack of a uniform accounts process. While we don't have uniform standard system like this, we're going to have a very hard time to implement a budget system that will create jurisprudence. So we really must end these 27 codes of accounts that exist in Brazil, creating this tangle of difficulties for all involved actors. So I think that this will create budget credibility, because once you have controlled jurisprudence that allows this feedbacking into the legislative structure, we will increase this credibility capacity. And finally, I would say that sustainability, transparency, personal expenditures in these recent amendments are very important tools, but I would like to bring an issue of the judgment of public accounts. Look at how important credibility is. And for credibility, this issue of the result is very important. The Accounts Tribunal, the Federal Court of Accounts, has published a document that talks about budget responsibility as a justified condition for this amendment in the accounting of public servants.
In that normative instruction, we have a very specific case, the importance of this control to the credibility. The accounts of the presidents of the Republic are not judged by the National Congress. Consequently, we do not have a jurisprudence in the National Congress on what is right or wrong in the budget law. And the time, consequently, will be used as an instrument of loss of credibility. For example, in the case of the accounts of President Dilma, they haven't been judged by the Congress yet. But not only President Dilma, but also Temer, Jair Bolsonaro, some even of Lula government, some of Fernando Henrique Cardoso were not judged by the Congress, so it will reduce the quality of the budget. And to finish, just to agree with Dr. Marcos Mendes mentioned, it's about this issue that he spoke very well about it, which is the amendments. These are things that will put us in a challenge to enhance our credibility. And I think Brazil already has a great effort on that sense. But not having a uniform conclusion on the financial law, along with a uniform process, a code of accounts, will allow us to build a new scenario of financial credibility. Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Heleno, and thank you for the specific mentioning of the external control. Let's remember that it is not a role of TCU, it is a role of the Congress. So we have a specific point of the courts of account that can improve the work, and also the judgment of the accounts that is done by the Congress, the accounts of the President, and also the governors and mayors. Thank you very much, Professor Heleno. Now, we're going to listen to Jefferson. He's the Secretariat of National Treasury. Let's listen to him now. Good morning to you all. I'd like to thank you for the invitation, and I'd like to congratulate TCU for this initiative, and I'd like to greet Leonardo, the moderator, and all the ones participating in this panel, and in this journey that we have in defense of the public accounts. I worked in different aspects in that matter to enhance public policies, for example, and I had the opportunity to interact with many of you. I would like to talk a little bit about the initiative of the handbook. I think it's very important. I'm an enthusiast of this type of initiative. 15 years ago, I participated in a group of specialists in debt in Latin America and the Caribbean. This group still exists, and we had a great exchange of experiences, bringing lots of advantages for everyone who was involved. So I think the main challenge of initiatives like this is to reach the applicability of the good practices that we see in other countries and the idiosyncrasies of the institutions and the norms and practices of specific countries. I think this is the main challenge that we see in the publication of this handbook. In any case, it's going to be a very, very fruitful product for all of us. Looking at the points that Neemias proposed, the initial project of the handbook is really clear, and in the Brazilian case, we have a good position because it's exactly in these moments that we go through, in the moments of crisis in which the governments have to work very quickly with a very active fiscal policy. have a lot to do with the credibility of the budget. In the beginning of the pandemic last year, we had to face some inconsistencies in the budget rules. The differences between the golden rule and the rule of the limit of expenses or spending limit. We can see these differences since 2018, and the inconsistency of the rules to be opposing the waiver rules of the golden rule and the rule of spending limit. When you face a pandemic with problems in the golden rule, the inconsistency between these rules emerges, and we had to face it, especially going through a constitutional amendment. After that, I think the country had a great capacity to use the instruments of fiscal policy to combat the pandemic, and especially with a very believable budget, with all the accounts registered in the budget and identified in a way that we have specific identification of the measures to combat the pandemic, which facilitated the use of the funds, which can be checked in the portal of the National Treasury. Talking about the gaps that we can see, that we can have expressive gains with this initiative of the handbook and this exchange of experiences that will strengthen the external control. Well, I think it's important, first of all, to make it clear that Brazil is in the opposite way to the increase of the efficiency of the fiscal policy in terms of flexibilizing the public policies. We have a bigger amount of obligatory expenses and with a decrease in the efficiency of what is left, especially due to the parliamentary amendments that were mentioned before. It is important to understand that this path of the tightening of the budget is totally different from the process of making the budget with a law that is more material. When we proposed 2 years ago the Constitutional Amendment 878, we had elements in terms of making the budget a material law, especially to avoid these exogenous pressures that Bruno Grossi mentioned in this discussion of creating the expenses, which is done separated from the discussion of the budget, and then it's brought in an external way to the budget, which has a part of the budget that is not controlled. So we had a disposition in the institutional law to avoid these laws or acts that would make expenses to not generate obligations until this bill could be assisted, to avoid the external pressures, these exogenous pressures. They do not only come from the discussion of creation of permanent expenses, but many times from legal decisions making the payment of expenses that are not in the budget obligatory. So this handbook is important to bring credibility. But we can see that in Brazil we have this difficulty with the tightness of the budget and the external elements. It's important to have the discussion that we are having of what is the objective of the public policy. We see the budget is believable when it meets the objectives to what the policies were proposed. But we need to understand the objectives of the policies. When you have a lot of obligatory expenses, we are there paying expenses that were created decades and decades ago without discussing the goal of the policies. And then here I make a connection with what the other participants mentioned. We have an evaluation material for public policies. We have evaluation protocols, assessment protocols for public policies. And it would be useful to understand the budget process. To understand the effectiveness of the policies to include them in the budget and organize this set of expenses. And then logically it will reflect in our difficulty to face the obligatory expenses, even with results, very mature results in the assessments. And lastly, so back to the point of the handbook, it's important to see the discussion that I brought, that within the draft of the handbook in Chapter 6, which refers to the risks and challenges for the credibility of the government, there is a proposal of including the case analysis of the function of the parliament in Brazil. With all the discussion that we have here, it seems to me that it is key to have the gain of a leadership position of the budget that was highlighted by Marcos Mendes. And as a suggestion to finish my first participation, I don't want to exceed my time. In terms of suggestion of the work of TCU, I think we are very well covered in what regards the external control and the work of the executive power in the budget process. Of course, we have some institutional difficulties to expand this analysis, but it would be interesting to have a public report or something like that to facilitate the social control and a manifestation of TCU regarding the approved budget law. We had an audit, a formal process of audit, and the proposal of the appropriation bill, the annual appropriation bill. But it would be interesting to have the social control on the law that was approved for everyone to reflect upon it. Not only the work of the executive branch, but also the important role of the legislative branch for the final version of the budget guidelines law and the appropriation bill. Thank you, Jefferson. So back to the point of the role of the legislative branch. So it is the final provocation of TCU, not only looking at the project, but also the product of the legislative process. So we have important issues to reflect upon, and we have seen advances in the production of evaluation content. So it's a big challenge on how to see how we can improve the decision process. So maybe it is a point that we haven't had the advances that we wish we could have. Now, Zé Roberto, thank you for being here with us. The floor is yours. Thank you, Leonardo, for inviting me. And here we are once again in the Federal Court of Accounts. I'd like to greet Ms. Arancha and all the other participants. I will talk about the general case of the world, general vision in the world, and the specific case of Brazil. I think it's a very important debate, and I'd like to contextualize what I mean. We are in a historical moment of a break of paradigms in all fields of economy and of society, and this issue of the public management and the management of the budget is included in that. I was remembering my doctorate degree thesis, And I paid attention in the fiscal resolutions of Keynes. And before Keynes, budget dealt with public expenses in general. There was no distinction. And he said, hey, wait, let's see what is everyday expenditure, what is maintenance, and what is the expansion, or what is creation and investment. So he called it capital budget. And then the United Kingdom started to separate the current expenditure and the capital expenditure, and the UN made a standard to world terms. So the UN, in my opinion, has a key role in the world, and we are going to a new paradigm. I think there's a clear data that it's not only treating well the public accounts, the public money, but also to have a governance with a good environmental and social balance. The fiscal discussion has to do with environmental and social spheres, so it will change the paradigms of what we are discussing. The discussion of the credibility. Personally, I think, and also my colleagues mentioned here, it has to do with trust, and the interaction in this new world is digital. And the key is how we're going to use the open world, the key of having new digital instruments for us to formulate and carry out policies, to assess these policies, and within this context as a whole, the credibility is included. There are several colleagues in the federal government working on this topic in the theoretical level, in the formulation of public policies with evidence, with data. Of course, we have some failures, and I have to mention the debate that I have with Professor Eleno, and we're talking about the revenue service, and sometimes providing data is disinformation, but it is the opposite. You have to provide the data so we can provide credibility. And now back to the Brazilian case, I'd like to make a connection with the work that the UN has. The UN has this development, the IDGE. And I'd like to talk about it in the case of Brazil. In the general index, the Brazilian position is 54. When you go to online services, it's 20. And when you go to internet users, it's 4th. So the Brazilian population is more on the internet, is more available online than what the government is delivering, although there is a great delivery from the government. But our physical structure and legal structure is behind in that aspect. OECD has a similar index, and Brazil is behind in all the indicators in this criteria, but there's only one criteria that Brazil is one of the first, which is the capacity of the users. It's the internet users to interact with the government. We are way better on this index than in the other indices. So Brazil doesn't have that wonderful wideband technology as the developed countries, but Brazilians use the internet to relate to the government much more than the countries that have technology. So, thinking of what we are discussing here, I think we need to overcome this, to have the budget process within the interaction with the citizens online. when he had the opportunity to think of the fiscal responsibility law, we thought of what is transparency, what is publicity. Transparency is not only publicizing. We are great at publicity. We publish a lot of data, and still there is some data missing. But sometimes we publish so much data that we lose the notion of the big picture. It's like 80 or 8 or 80. There's an exceeding of data in some cases and a lack of information in other cases. And we have to have a debate on that. The external control is in one end of this process. We need to formulate public policies with evidence and use the same evidence for assessment. We need to think of how to use the digital tools and the availability of Brazilians to participate digitally. We're talking about a country with 200 million inhabitants, so we're not going to do the in-person assessment. Now let me just make one more comment. I know my time is almost up, but Bruno reminded us that our basic law of budget is from 1964. The budget guidelines law has lots of rules, and much of it is not the law. It is like some ideas, some things to support it. Professor Heleno mentioned the lack of uniformization in the country. I saw the balance of states and municipalities. There's a brilliant work that was done, but there are some treatments to be improved. It is time for us to have the efforts to consolidate and harmonize the fiscal rules. Maybe you can have a unified code. So we go to the Constitution all the time, but it can be confusing. I think we should have the effort to harmonize the rules and include them in only one document. It would facilitate the governance. The governance is in the beginning, credibility is in the other end. I'd like to insist that we need to believe, and St. Thomas, the one that only believes when they see it, is in the digital environment with the interaction with the population. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Zé. I'd like to highlight this final point that he's already synthesizing a little bit of the discussions. We'll be talking about this a little later. This idea that there is space for improvement of the institutions in terms of talking about fiscal and budget rules. And this is one of the issues that we really need to increase governance. And depending on the design that we make and how seriously we take this design, we can contribute to having our budget credibility. We've been receiving some questions, and these are answers for the survey that we have right now. This event started, we have a little bit over 1,000 people enrolled. A large amount of these people watch these events without enrolling because they're watching it on YouTube, so we'll have a few thousand participants. And a smaller percentage participates in the survey. The survey will be open throughout the event, but I'm going to share the screen with you so that I can show you something, a question, and then based on that, we'll talk about our next discussions. So now you should be seeing on your screen the answers to one of the questions. Based on the vision of our viewers today, what are the possible critical factors for budget credibility today? Do we have any we might have some changes here, but basically first we have the deficiency in strategic planning turned towards budget priorities in the medium and long term. It has to do with budget laws, it has to do with what Zé Roberto mentioned about the budget guidelines law, and we have this discussion of budget pluriannuality. And so the second point well, was also mentioned here, maybe not on these words, is the personality in the allocation of budget resources. That is, without allocating these resources without basis on evidence, without criteria, as established by the Constitution and demands of the population at a certain point. And we have the third point, which is the worsening of the lack of balance between collections and expenditures. And we have been creating a lot of deficits due to this. The fourth one is the asymmetry in the action of external control in the three spheres of the government. And the fifth one is the reduction of budget adherence to the general norms of public finance. So the execution of the financing is going farther and farther away from these general rules of public finance. And so beyond these issues, here on the screen, I'm going to comment on a few observations that were made in the YouTube chat by our viewers. Some colleagues are saying that the judiciary also needs to be included in this dialogue. I don't think the judiciary power showed up. I know that the executive and legislative showed up a lot in the speeches today, remembering that they do have a role in budget talks. Another observation that reinforces the Eleno's point, there's a need for a national law for external control processes, and how can we, in the legislative manner, do ex-ante and ex-post regulations of these public expenditures. And now I want a final round of thoughts about these points. Before we go to the debaters, I'd first like Arantxa and Nehemias to comment based on these observations that were brought about by people from civil society who are watching us today. If you think that these points that were brought forward, do they fit on the vision on this project, what it will discuss in terms of issues and items on about budget credibility? Obviously, you're just starting the project, it still hasn't advanced, but I'd like your point of view from that. Okay, let's start with Arantxa.
Thank you, and I think this has been a very rich debate, and I think it resonates with what we have been reflecting in the preparation of the handbook, and I think it's also aligned with some of the comments that have been received through the chat and also the feedback. And I would like to highlight maybe a few points, and also reflecting on those comments and this survey. I think we, as a result of the research and also based on the discussions with auditors and with other actors, I think we are quite clear that the lack of credibility has to do not only with technical factors, but also with political considerations, and that a lot of it has to do with what happened outside the budget. And what happens outside the budget is different in different countries. In some countries, maybe sources of funding from donors. In other countries, maybe resources related with extractive industries. It's going to be different, but it's really a significant challenge to credibility. I think for me, it's particularly interesting, all the reflections regarding budget governance, and not only laws and regulations, the need to update and streamline and cover some of the gaps, but also eliminate maybe some regulations that are overlapping. Not only that kind of legal aspects and the enforcement of the legal framework, but also the importance of the core processes that sustain the budget and make it credible. And this link between planning, midterm and long-term planning, budgeting and evaluation. And the linkages between these three processes is what we have found that is a challenge in almost every country. And I think it's really key in order to have budgets that are more credible, that actually what we say we are going to do then matches where we put the money, and then we have the information, the data, and the feedback to be able to improve that process. And we don't see those feedback loops happening. So I think this is very, very important. And I think it's also, I was happy to see the strategic planning on the top of the feedback from participants in the chat and in the audience. I think this is really key. I mean, planning processes in general, not only in Latin America, but in many other countries, still need a lot of attention, and how to link planning and policy making with budgeting is key. And also in the context of sustainable development is one of the issues we have found quite challenging. And I would like to say also, I think it's very important that in the reflection regarding the role of supreme audit institutions, I know that the role of TCU is very important and you have a very strong supreme audit institution, but I think it was very important that in the discussion you brought the link between Congress and the external auditors, the supreme audit institution. This is key. And also we still find also in the work that we have been doing in different countries that those synergies between the legislature and supreme audit institutions need to be improved. So we can have very good audit reports, but then ultimately is Congress the main accountability institution that has to act on the findings of those reports. So I think those synergies are very important. And one last point I would like to say regarding the applicability of the handbook, which we know it's a key issue, and also how to engage with other stakeholders. For us, this is very relevant, and also that's why we see a lot of value in this kind of conversations like we are having here today. As part of the project, there is, not only the conversation with auditors, but there is a community of practice where there are experts, civil society, members of Ministry of Finance, budget offices, parliaments, and we hope that we can leverage also that community of practice in order to be able to support the project and to strengthen conversations like this one. So I will give the floor to Nehemias now, and thank you for the feedback and the debate.
Obrigado, Arantia. Nehemias, por favor.
Obrigado, Arantia, também. Gostaria inicialmente de registrar o altíssimo nível do debate das contribuições que nós estamos tendo nesse
Very high level of the debate that we're having on this panel. For those of us who participated in the organization of the event, I'd just like to mention that we started very well. The event has started with a wealth of contributions. And now I'd like to talk about the survey results on these first 2 points, the efficiency of strategic planning. So there's this link between planning and budget, and personality when applying resources. That is, resource allocation without criteria. So, and this was reflected in the debate that we had with our specialist panel. And Arantia also mentioned this now. So we need to have this feedback loop between the results of the public policies and budget. This should be the main input when creating the budget. The issue of budget governance, which you have highlighted well. And the last point that I'd like to mention, there's a concern of people in lack of planning and problems in allocation. This dialogues a lot with what Professor Alberto Afonso said, in the sense that we have a society that is very dynamic, and the demands change constantly in the digital world, and it's a source of dialogue, but also of insatisfaction and constant demands from society. And there's a bigger and bigger importance on issues of sustainability and social and environmental balances, in the sense and in the measure that public budgets do not meet these demands from society, we end up losing legitimacy and responsiveness in the public budget in relation to demands from society, and this creates an insatisfaction of society in relation to the actions of the public power. So these are huge challenges on how to deal with this. Brazil has advanced a lot in digital government and in being responsive to demands from society, but this is a challenge that remains. So I just basically like to thank you all for the contributions in the debate. And now I open the floor to
Agora a gente faz uma rodada final.
Now let's do our last round. I'm going to start with these answers of the survey by our audience, and I'd like to ask you each the following. If we look at the Brazilian model, what we see, especially in the federal government, which is what we know, and that's where we act, what would be the important points to highlight? What is the strongest part as far as budget credibility, and what is the point that is the weakest and needs to have a critical evaluation? So you don't need to be very specific about it, but as a whole, let's say we saw this has been reiterated by a lot of people, but it's clear that we have certain advances that were built throughout the years, but also, despite these advances a few of which we can highlight, we also have a few gaps that we need to fill. So what's your vision about what are the priorities? What is the most critical point when we're talking about our budget credibility, or in a wider sense, budget budget credibility as a whole? Let's start with Bruno. Thank you, Leonardo. Well, at first, I'd just like to apologize to everyone. I have a commitment in a few minutes. I'd like to apologize to everyone. So, I think that a lot of the debaters have mentioned the advances that we've had, especially after a few non-trivial lessons, especially after the impeachment. So our advancement in budget credibility after this period, with the mistakes and the successes that we had after this period, helped us to have a more robust mechanism, both in relation to the fiscal part as well as the credibility of the budget in its various aspects. Not that it doesn't suffer risks, and like some certain people have mentioned, they could be captured by Congress or other actors, but I think we've had various advances in the form of the budget. Zé Roberto also mentioned, sometimes you have too much information and this can confuse people more than help. So maybe we should have more things in terms of transparency. Now, I'd just like to highlight the following. Professor Helena talked about the constitutional changes that we have no time to do this evaluation. These constitutional changes, in fact, it's easier to change the Constitution than to approve a complementary law. And that's true because ever since the Constitution, we weren't able to approve that complementary law in the budget. But we've had a variety of different constitutional amendments. And so sometimes it's a hard time for us to understand what this actually means with all these constitutional amendments. I think this absence of a more operative norm, because if you bring everything to the Constitution, you create unnecessary actions and you can't go as far in depth as you should be able to, as we want to be able to. So we have this issue as a priority in trying to really rescue and complement Law 4320 would be of great use. And everyone here mentioned this issue of being captured. Unfortunately, we had an undesirable factor in this process, which was the loss of transparency in terms of individual legislative amendments, because of this figure of special transfers. Unfortunately, due to a constitutional issue, we are not able to evaluate this with the due care that we should. But I really fear for the deficiency of transparency and information, the lack of clarity of the applications of these expenditures. So I think that these are the main points. Once again, I'd like to apologize to everyone because I'm going to have to leave, but I wish you all great debate. Thank you all so much.
Thank you for the comments. Thank you for your presence and the support to the event.
Agora eu vou passar para o Marcos.
Thank you very much. Now let's listen to Marcus. Well, I also need to leave. I have a commitment at 12:30, so I will leave as soon as I finish my part, and I apologize for that. Another question is important, on the question on what to do. We need to check all the obligation of parliamentary amendment. We need to check on that. We need to see we need to have a clear rule on the limit of the legislative branch on the budget to prevent the reduction of obligatory expenses to give space to the amendments. So it was outrageous what happened last year, and it's a reality in the political situation in Brazil. I'd like to highlight some important points that I heard from you. Arancha spoke about the importance of assessment. I think TCU should be a hub of assessment. Today, we have the executive branch doing some evaluations, and I have academia people doing the public expenditure assessment. So it's important for them to have access to data. So if TCU had a calling for the academia to produce data analysis on public accounts, we would have very interesting results without, rather than only depending on the executive branch. Also, we see this problem of the court order debt and the change in the tax system, etc. And TCU has a large experience on using AI and robots, and they could have a cooperation with the executive branch to have a preventive mapping of fiscal risks that come in the judicial level, in the legislative level, so we could avoid some surprises and meteors per se in our fiscal system. Also, the importance to reduce the amount of procedures. I think the pluriannual plan is a loss of time. I think this mechanism has no credibility and functionality, and the way it in the version that we have in the Congress of this new law, there is the extinction of the pluriannual plan to have a more modern way to guarantee the temporality of the project and to reduce the amount of procedures and legislation. I'd like to call your attention and to be against the argument to have the fiscal rules out of the Constitution. I disagree. I think we have an important core in the Constitution. I think the expanding limit survived until today. It's because it is in the Constitution. The fiscal responsabilization law is included, is a complementary law, and other laws open casuistic exemptions. And then when we woke up, the fiscal responsibility law was deteriorated. So if you take all the fiscal rules to the complementary laws in an environment of political pressure, we can weaken the rules. So basically, this is my contribution. I thank you very much for inviting me, and I wish you a great end of debate to you all. Thank you very much, Marcus, for your final contributions. Now let's listen to Ariosto. Well, I think I'm going to mention some advances and some points that we need to pay attention to improve the capacity of our credibility. Regarding governance, I'd like to bring some important points. We have an institutionalization in the scope of the executive power, which is the central core of the government, where there is a discussion on the allocation priorities in terms of budget and the budget execution. So we have an alignment of the center of the government, the Civil House, Ministry of Economy, regarding the management of the budget allocation. But there's a point here that we need to criticize is regarding the cycle of assessment. It happens twice a year, but it foments adjustments regarding the short term. The more we have an instrument, a fiscal instrument, in which we adjust the result goals, evaluating the income and dispenses, it foments adjustments in a short-term view every 6 months. So it is a point that generates instability in the budget program of the exercise. We have advanced in transparency in the model of assessment and the fiscal adjustments of short-term, but we generate an expectation of all the institutions to review their budget programming or even the evaluation of the expenditure limit. This fiscal evaluation instrument was applicable to the spending limit. Every 6 months we evaluate the spending limit, and it tends to have instability around what is left from the obligatory expenses. Of course, in this management model, we have the commitment on the responsibility. I think it's positive. Several institutions, they have their projections and their responsibility matrices, where you have parameters that are generated by the political economic secretariat, policies that are estimated by the competent institutions, and other mandatory expenses. So having this matrix of responsibility is an improvement. Not only the work of TCU, but all the other reports that are a result of this process. I think there is an instability that is generated by these evaluations 2 times a year. Regarding the budget planning, the preparation for that, I'm happy that this topic of this pluriannual plan is highlighted. I think this element, we call it PPA, it has to be evaluated regarding its context and its content. Maybe not extinguish it, but to think of a different deadlines in the budget process. So we need to strengthen this point. I think it's a critical point that was highlighted. But at the same time, I think we need to discuss on the strategic planning in the scope of organizations. The pluriannual plan has a contaminated vision, per se, in what regards the strategies. The problems of society are treated in the sectorial policies, in the scope of organizations that carry out the public policies. We have seen in the past few years the government working well in the vision of strengthening the institutional strategic plan. And there's a risk for us to institutionalize too much the strategic plan and be in the hands of the pluriannual plan, something that is bonded to a law with different procedural criteria. And I would say a famous quote: to transform a plan in law is killing the planning. So the planning has to do with management and the necessary update and review of the planning. And we cannot be imprisoned by a legal instrument. But we have to, of course, improve the sectorial policies of strategic planning. We need to strengthen these points, the ability to plan in the social and infrastructure areas. There was a loss on in these areas in our past period, and it's an important and necessary point in the access to the planning of budget. We need to strengthen the institutional capacity in the sectorial areas. And I'd like to go back to the topic of evaluation or assessment. How can we think of this process? And I remember in the discussions that we had in this matter, I think that evaluation model should be done an external evaluation taken by the market. We have a market of evaluators, and in that case we would strengthen the work and avoid the contamination of the political executors and institutions that have a passion to certain topics. So the evaluation should be external. This is my vision on that. We should hire market specialists that work on this topic. We need to discuss the structuring of the evaluation model within the model of indicators regarding our credibility. How can we assess the incorporation of elements of the process of planning the budget? These are the three main topics, and I'm happy to have this hearing on the concerning points. I would like to bring one more point concerning the existence of rules. I think we have too many rules, not fiscal rules. I mean, I think they are relevant for maintaining the spending limit, and they are really key to recover the balance. We have had deficits since 2014, and in 2016 we had the worst situation, having the result of 2.6 of primary debt. In the short term, we are going to a fiscal balance, going to 1.6 of the GDP after the COVID-19 crisis. So we started the year with near 2.0. So we have the risks that coming with 2002 in terms of fiscal risks, and we need to think of the maintenance of the fiscal rules. We have seen this guidance on the recent review on that, but we need to simplify the fiscal rules. Professor Helena mentioned this broad revision of the budget rules in terms of budget guidelines law. I think we have too many rules. We need to simplify the budget rules. It is a very important agenda for the next management. It's a process of simplification of rules. So let's stick with the principles and try to simplify the rules, which are too many already. It's a large set of rules. I would say that in 25 years in this area of budget, we say that the budget area is a black box. No one knows what is in there. I would say that the complexity of the past years was way beyond the other years. So we have specialists on pieces of this black box. So we specialized the budget specialization. So we need to reflect upon that. Well, you just gave ideas for 3 different seminars. Thank you so much for that. We will talk about that again. And just remembering what Professor Helena mentioned, we need to have like 6 people in Brazil today who knows what is the budget guidelines law. So, Professor Helena, the word is yours.
Really, I think that everything that has been said here today, well, this theme is really interesting when you gather such qualified, intelligent people. The problem, Leonardo, is that we think of a topic to talk about, and then people before you say it even better than you would. So It's a little hard. So I think that this event is really fundamental because it seems to me that it's a call for the powers to understand the importance of budget laws in Brazil. I would like to highlight, and you remember the speech of Minister Aris Brito, that budget law is the law that conducts the financial constitution of the country, and that is why I really like this proposal of simplifying it, but a simplification that can come as a way to fulfill the constitutions in Article 163. The National Congress should unify complementary legislation and create, or maybe review, Law 4320 in the spirit of a single complementary law, let's say, as far as finances go. So the general public finance norms, I would say that they are a huge priority for this issue of budget credibility. And the law 4320 reflects the budget principles of the 1950s after the World War II. So in the whole world, it shows, it makes us seem not too credible, because if we continue with this law, it's an old law that still looks like it did in its origin. So I think that today we could be great to unify the fiscal responsibility law, all the complementary laws on public debts, all of the issues relating to the general regimes that are in Law 4320, and to rethink the budget. We have certain bills in National Congress. Not all of them are necessarily updated, and it'd be important to look at this topic once again. Another point that I would like to mention is the issue of PPA. I don't want this panel to come out with the idea that the pluriannual plan is something unnecessary. No, far from it. Or much to the contrary, the pluriannual plan today is the only planning instrument of the state, in the sense that other instruments, municipalities and states, are not steady in their planning, and also the federal government also doesn't have a planning. So now the only instrument that we have is PPA. But I think that control institutions have a huge importance, and we must establish criteria so that the Constitution is made effective in the demand that the budget guidelines law and the pluriannual plan follow the pluriannual plan. And the pluriannual plan can't be a piece of fiction as far as education, health, and all the services that are established therein. So that's why we must end budget casuism. We must look at planning. In the Article 174, it said very clearly, planning is compulsory for the state. And it's compulsory because it's based on them that private stakeholders and actors plan. So in this sense, we cannot accept the idea that the PPA is a second category norm. No, it's a part of Brazilian budget law. Brazilian budget law is made up of three specific laws: the pluriannual plan, the budget guidelines law with its goals, and the appropriation law. So the TCU has this role of external control internally in each institution. We're going to have to take that into account. We're going to have to go into that fight. I'd like to also highlight that we do have advancements, but of course these advances in a certain point they conflict with reality, let's say. So we do need to have control indexes of budget credibility, and we must have them that in a way that is applied to the federal government, the states, and the municipalities, so that we can actually look at the truth, the reality, so that we can have trust in our budgets. So look at the cases of payables. We looked, and TCU has identified in 2015 problems with municipalities and states, an index of 51% of rest of payables and the growth of stocks in relation to the volume of executed expenditures. So we still have this plague in our country, and we still are not effective in relation to this. I compare it to a way to combat illiteracy. So in education, we have the mission of combating illiteracy. The payables and so in the end, we have a mountain of payables that are not paid, and we send this onwards. And so these accrued liabilities are very important. And I think that academia and civil society will be available for this process, and I have no doubt that if we advance to a dimension that considers budget truth alongside public planning and control, that's where we will find the essence of what budget credibility really is. And this is what will actually give us the conditions so that we can have a sustainable public debt, so that we can have a series of other principles that are realized. So I'd like to greet all of you once again, and I want to have an express mention to Dr. Luciane Pereira, together with Dr. Alessandro Caldeira and Leonardo, and everyone who has been strongly committed to having this event, which is very important for Brazilian society. Congratulations. Thank you, Professor Heleno. And thank you so much for doing this recognition of the PPA and for thanking the whole team. Well, I'm going to try and be very brief. I know that I went a little over time on my last time I talked. So when I got the invitation about this issue of budget credibility and budget rigidity and evaluation, well, I'd like to come back to the point that I think that this initiative and this sharing of experiences is something potentially very useful. I think that Brazil has a lot to gain in this sharing of experiences, and I think other countries also have a lot to win with the participation of Brazil and the TCU in this initiative, in this handbook, because we have a very solid infrastructure that's very well organized, that's very structured for control. So I think it will be very productive for everyone. And I'd like to bring my main point, something that might be interesting in the initiative, it could be included in a certain way, would be exactly this. We're discussing here, how do we gain credibility? If we do not bring the process of evaluation into the budget process in such a way that it affects the budget process, we create a process in which we start losing credibility. And I'll tell you why. It'd be interesting to see the experience of countries in the inclusion of the results of the evaluation inside the budget process. How could this make the budget process more sensitive and include other parts? So might bring in to this issue of credibility. Inside the very concept of credibility that we're bringing here, you will lose credibility when countries spend or demand taxes outside the plan. So the more we spend with indexed expenses, the more that the new demands for social policies are going to be pushed out of the budget. Why? Because we have a budget restriction that needs to be respected. Yes. Everything that grows automatically that I have to spend in a compulsory manner that I have that is indexed, this is really consuming my budget space in relation to other demands which are going to be cropping up and they're going to be pushed outside of the budget. And so this is when a few cases were mentioned in which the concession process includes as an obligation for the concession holder certain public policies which therefore are pushed outside the budget because the budget is all consumed by these compulsory expenditures that I think deserve to be evaluated and discussed. That is, this is the first point of the answer to the survey. We have a hard time including planning, pluriannual planning, in such a way that if you have the space to plan when you have over 90% compulsorily indexed expenditures, you have not a lot of room to plan. Most of it is already defined. And then an anecdotal evidence is the following. How much does the federal government spends? They spend 8.3 billion reais per year with extinct professions such as typewriters, and they can't get away from these expenditures. That's one more evidence of this lack of flexibility for public administration. No one here is talking about questioning the point of stability of public servants, but we don't have this. We need to reallocate workforce inside public service. And so we have 8.3 billions that are committed yearly with expenditures that we don't really need to go to an in-depth analysis of this expenditure in order to understand that it needed to be reallocated. So when we have this commitment, we have less space to plan our budget process and to include new demands that crop up. One new demand is the revitalization of river basins and sustainability issues. It's very natural that these have cropped up recently, but we can't stop spending on expenditures that were established 30, 40 years ago. So I think that's a really important point for our budget credibility. So starting from the moment when everything is predefined, new demands will crop up and there's no space for them. So we really need to have this capacity of evaluating public expenditures and putting forth these results of these evaluations in the budget. And once again, this issue of credibility, I think it can be an anchor of the discussion, this concept, because budget credibility depends on the government reaching its objectives with the budget instruments. Well, we need to discuss what the goals are. What are these objectives of compulsory, of a lot of compulsory expenditures that we execute? So they're not efficient, let's say. How can we adequate them? What are the objectives of public policies with compulsory expenditures? What about public policies that lead to changes in the budget? Can we reallocate these expenditures considering the goal that was proposed and our capacity of reaching it? Well, I think that is the central issue that I like to point out. I think the TCU throughout time has contributed quite a bit to this issue of evaluation. I met Leonardo in the decisions of decision 1718 from the TCU, in which we were evaluating the subsidies policies of the government, and I think it was from there that a lot of alignments cropped up and came out of those meetings, but we still are deficient of bringing these evaluation results into the budget process, and so that we can fight against the rigidity of the budget, which ends up pushing to pushing other social demands, newer social demands, out of the budget. So I think that's the main message that I like to leave as the big need to really face this issue. If all of you want to, for all of those who want an efficient state policy. Thank you, Jefferson. Zé, you're going to close out our debate. Go ahead.
Ativar aqui. Eu queria fechar voltando
I would like to close going back to the beginning.
segunda rodada.
In our second round,
Orçamentário, né? E eu não resisto aqui a lembrar
and
os colegas.
I
Eu acho que é um assunto que é
tend to remind my colleagues, and I think it's a topic that is not very well debated in Brazil around budget. What happened in the National Constituent Assembly in 1987 and 1988. I had the opportunity
na Assembleia.
to work in this assembly,
Desde o início,
and since
o processo
the beginning, the budget process was designed for a parliamentary regime. As a matter of fact, the Brazilian constitutions had only 1 or 2 articles regarding budget, as well as many constitutions in the world. And then in 87, when we started to build the constitution, there was a decision to create a budget. And it's worth remembering that we were coming from a military government in which the budget proposal were approved by were approved in a way that the Brazilian Congress didn't participate at all in the creation of budget. And the response that we see in the democratic constitution is, well, if I am being against the military regime, dictatorship, the idea is to provide more power to the legislative and executive powers in the budget. So the Brazilian Constitution creates a joint committee to analyze the budget. So I think no other constitution in the world has this amount of detail in that matter. Also, TCU knows about all these details in the Constitution. But in the middle of the assembly, there was a decision to change the type of system. When there was a voting of the order of the states, the majority decided to have the presidential regime, but there was no revision in the rest of the constitutional text. So we have the constitutional text prepared for a parliamentary regime working in a presidential regime. And the rest, you know, what we see here throughout history. If a president is stronger or weaker, the Congress interferes more or less in the budget process, either inflating or uninflating the incomes, cutting expenses. So we have to remember that it is something central in this discussion. I think that we could remember what dear Arancha mentioned. What is the Brazilian democracy and the responsibilities that we have? I think the discussion of parliamentary amendment, well, I don't see any problem with the amendment, but the problem is that they are not responsible to the amendments that they proposed. So it is a discussion that we could have. In any case, it is a central political discussion. It's not simple, it's not trivial. And I think it's important to take the support of the UN, OECD, to study the experiences of other countries in the budgetary processes, because you will see the political rationale responding to the budget process so we can improve. I'm quite optimistic because we have laws, we have have good human resource, we have good technology. We have a population that, in my opinion, responds and is interested to participate in public life, taking advantage of the open channel. But we need to have a political behavior that could result, and I think we agree on that, to have only one fiscal code, only one. A consolidation of the whole legislation in terms of fiscal or budget, to the control of debt, the internal control, external control, social control, everything in only one document. The effort of having this consolidation in only one document is important, not only to simplify the work and to give more efficiency to the civil servants and providing more transparency to the citizens, but above all to have a political discussion of what is the budget in the Brazilian democracy and how we can share responsibilities among the powers. We can see that there is a little complication on that. So these are my remarks. I'd like to congratulate TCU, the Federal Court of Accounts, and all my colleagues who participated in this discussion of this panel. It was long, but it was really useful, really fruitful. And we call it is the first budget week, so I hope there will be many more budget weeks because we only gain in initiatives like these. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you, Jose. Yeah, we can have at least once a year this type of meeting. I would like to know if Arantia or Nemias have any remarks, but you have a space for your final remarks if you want.
Yes, I know we are over time, so it's really just very quickly to thank all the contributions. I think this kind of conversations is what we are looking for in the project. And as you could see, we could continue talking for days about this. So I really hope that this is just a first opportunity to engage in this conversation, and we will be able to leverage the knowledge and the expertise that all the experts here have in order to support the project and contribute to strengthen the project as we move forward. And just to thank TCU for the excellent institutional cooperation and for the expertise and the commitment with the project. So thank you very much to everyone.
We thank you, Arantia, for inviting us to participate in this initiative. Nemias, floor is yours. I just would like to thank all the ones who participated in this debate. It will certainly contribute to the engagement in this project that we see here on screen, and the whole situation and the whole work of the specialists in public budget. So all the contributions will be very enriching, and I thank you all for being here with us. Thank you, Nemias. Well, given our time, I will not make any summary of the contributions. There are many points that deserved final comments, but we have some complementary laws that do not exist, some gaps in the legislation, and on the other hand, we have the budget guidelines law trying to fill in these gaps, try to play this role of the management of the budget. So this is certainly a reflection that Roberto brought. Maybe we should have only one unified fiscal code, at least containing the main points. and that could bring some more a more clear order, so we could have many gains in that area. Some of the topics that we discussed here will be discussed in the next panels in the next days. So we will continue in the afternoon with the first roundtable in an hour. But we have some topics, for example, parliamentary amendments. We have some panels talking about that. We have representatives of the government. We have Bruno Grossi from the Civil House, Jefferson representing the Treasury, representatives of the center of the government that deals with the management of the finances. But we will have other dialogues with different people from different parts of the government, such as health, infrastructure, social policies. So we will have very interesting debates to be carried out in the next days. You can access the program on YouTube and also in the channel of TCU. So I invite you all to participate. Thank you all for participating. Neemias, Professor Heleno, Marcus had to leave, and Bruno as well, but Ariosto, all of you who were with us, contributing with suggestions in the chat. So thank you all, and see you next time.